Today, we're jumping into one of the most pivotal and world-changing events in all of modern history, the First World War. It was known as the Great War for a reason. It was a conflict on a scale nobody had ever seen before, and it completely redrew the map of the world. So, let's get right into it.
So this is the big question, right? It just sounds impossible. How on earth does the murder of one man, an archduke, trigger a domino effect that results in 20 million deaths and brings four massive empires crashing down? Well, to even begin to understand how that could happen, you've got to see what the world looked like back in 1914.
And this map right here, it shows you the situation perfectly. Europe wasn't just a bunch of separate countries minding their own business. It was basically two giant, heavily armed teams staring each other down. On one side, you had the Triple Entente. That's France, Britain, and Russia. And on the other, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Because of this tangled web of promises, a fight between any two of them could drag everybody else into the fire.
And that leads us right into our first section. Those alliances were just one reason why Europe at the time is so often described as a powder keg. It was as packed with tension, waiting for a single spark to set the whole thing off. So there were really four big issues bubbling under the surface for years. You had the alliances we just saw. Then there was militarism, a massive arms race, with every country building a bigger and bigger armies, almost like they knew a war was coming. Add to that imperialism, this fierce global scramble for colonies and resources. And finally, you have nationalism, which might have been the most explosive ingredient of all. What's so interesting about nationalism is that it was kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it made the big powers like Germany, France, and Britain incredibly competitive with each other. But on the other hand, it was also fueling these powerful independence movements, especially in the Balkans, where ethnic groups were desperate to break free from the old empires and form their own nations. And this was the spark. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne is shot and killed in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. And then the dominoes just start to fall, fast. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia, who has a treaty with Serbia, starts getting its army ready. Germany sees its ally, Austria-Hungary, being threatened, so it declares war on Russia and on Russia's ally, France. And just like that, the powder keg explodes. So, the war is on. But as we're about to see, the way this conflict was actually fought, well, it turned out to be nothing like anyone had ever imagined. The belief that this would be a quick war of fast-moving armies was about to be brutally shattered. You know, it's one of the biggest ironies of the whole war. In the summer of 1914, soldiers marched off to war with crowds cheering them on, totally convinced they'd be back home with their families by Christmas. They really believed it would be a short, decisive little adventure. But the reality was a nightmare. Germany's whole strategy, the famous Schlieffen Plan, was to knock out France super quickly. But it didn't work. They were stopped at the Battle of the Marne. That fast war of movement just ground to a halt. And what came next was years of horrible trench warfare. A bloody, grinding stalemate where millions died fighting over a few hundred yards of mud. It wasn't until 1918, after one last desperate German offensive failed, that the Allies finally broke through. I mean, it's almost impossible for us to really imagine what life was like down in those trenches. This quote gives you a small window into it. It wasn't just the moments of combat. It was the constant, daily misery, the endless mud, the giant rats, the disease, and that soul-crushing fear of just waiting for the next shell to land. And what made this stalemate so incredibly deadly was all the new industrial technology. Machine guns made it suicidal to charge across open ground. Poison gas introduced a whole new kind of chemical terror. And for the very first time, you have tanks, fighter planes, and submarines, U-boats, turning the battlefield into a terrifying three-dimensional killing zone. Now, when you have warfare on this industrial scale, you can't limit it to just the soldiers at the front. The entire nation has to get involved. And this brings us to this idea of a total war, where that clean line between the home front and the battlefront completely disappears. Just look at this shift. Before the war, civilian life was one thing, and the military was another. But in a total war, everything and everyone is mobilized. Governments take control of the entire economy. Factories that made cars are now making weapons. Food gets rationed so the troops can eat. Every single citizen becomes a part of the war machine.
So how do you get everyone on board for this massive sacrifice? Propaganda.
It was everywhere. Posters, films, newspapers, all designed to boost morale, get people to enlist, and, crucially, to dehumanize the enemy, to make them seem like evil monsters. It made the unbelievable costs of the war seem necessary. This total war also triggered one of the biggest social changes of the century. With millions of men away fighting, someone had to do their jobs, and women stepped up, big time. They went to work in munitions factories, they drove buses, they worked on farms. Their contribution was absolutely vital, and it became a powerful, undeniable argument for giving women the right to vote after the war. And as if the war wasn't horrific enough, in its final year, something even deadlier arrived. The Spanish flu pandemic swept across a globe full of exhausted, malnourished people and moving armies. It spread like wildfire, killing at least 20 million people, even more than were killed in all the fighting. So after 4 years of unimaginable destruction, the guns finally fell silent on November 11th, 1918. But, and this is a huge but, the peace that followed was deeply broken. It didn't solve the world's problems. In many ways, it just created new ones and set the stage for the next great conflict. The scale of the aftermath is just mind-boggling. We're talking about 17 million dead, and whole empires that had dominated the world for centuries, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian. They were just gone, wiped off the map. In their place, Europe was redrawn, creating new countries, but also creating a whole new set of tensions. At the very center of this new world was the Treaty of Versailles, and it was incredibly harsh on Germany. They were hit with the infamous war guilt clause, forcing them to accept all the blame. They had to pay crippling amounts of money, slash their military to almost nothing, and give up huge chunks of their territory. Now you have to remember, for the Allies, after 4 years of death and destruction, there was huge public pressure to make Germany pay. But for many Germans, this treaty was a national humiliation that planted deep seeds of anger and resentment. You know, out of all this destruction came one really hopeful idea, the League of Nations. It was supposed to be an organization where countries could talk through their problems instead of going to war. A fantastic goal, right? But the reality was, it was doomed from the start. It was fatally weakened when the United States, its biggest champion, ended up not even joining. And without an army of its own, it had no real power to enforce its decisions. Which brings us to our final chilling question. The Great War was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but its flawed conclusion has been called a peace to end all peace. With all that resentment simmering in Germany and a weak international system trying to keep order, you have to ask, was the stage already set for another, even more devastating war just 20 years down the road? It's a question historians are still debating today.